When I post neuroaffirming content referring to autistics and ADHDers as neurodivergents and not mentioning the variety of other mental health diagnoses or conditions that people often lump under that category, I get people who jump down my throat telling me that I should be including them, which makes it hard because I want to speak specifically about the autistic and ADHD experience, and neurodivergence is just an easy way to label that, both of those diagnoses or neurotypes. And people get kind of up in arms because they feel like I'm excluding other diagnoses that they feel deserve to be under that umbrella. And I understand the need for a term that is neuroaffirming and less pathologizing than what the medical establishment has created through the DSM and these diagnoses. And at the same time, if you lump every diagnosis under the same category, the category itself starts to lose any kind of definitive label or function. If everybody is basically, or every diagnosis goes under neurodivergence, then it becomes diagnostically null and void. Not that it is an accepted diagnostic label, it is just parlance, or it's slang that is not widely accepted by the medical establishment. It's more kind of embedded in the neuroaffirming movement. And I understand the importance of depathologizing mental health conditions because the medical practice always focuses on deficits rather than strengths or possibilities, and can be very limiting. But at the same time, there are lots of kind of problems with doing that. And I've discussed previously on my channel some of the challenges, and I'll go over again some of them, and I'll introduce a couple others. First of all was the point I made that diagnostically, if all these diagnoses are neurodivergent, what really does neurodivergence mean as a label anymore? The second thing is, for me, personally speaking, I like to use neurodivergence to refer to autism and ADHD and some other diagnoses because it represents the existence of a different neurotype, not necessarily pathology. And I think other diagnoses are indicative of pathology rather than the wiring of the brain being a specific way from birth. And it's hard-coded and very difficult, if not impossible, to change, as I think is the case with the autism and ADHD neurotypes, myself having both. They become a core part of our identity and how we show up in the world and how we express, communicate. And I think they're inseparable from identity. And I would stand to reason that depression is not an inseparable part of somebody's identity. It can be a temporary state that can be treated. So kind of lumping in major depressive disorder as neurodivergence, I don't think the two are comparable. I think being neuroaffirming about neurotypes, because they are so closely tied to identity in the case of autism and ADHD, I think it makes sense to want to depathologize that, while also recognizing that autism and ADHD often does present with pathology, with co-occurring challenges. And then the other thing is, we don't have a single brain in a jar somewhere that is a completely normal brain to use as a reference point. So defining something as being, the divergence from normal is hard to do because we don't know if that even exists, objectively speaking. Everybody has, for example, a wavy neurocognitive profile, certain strengths and certain weaknesses in certain areas, right? Neurodivergents have spikier ones, so there's more extremes. But there's recognition that there is variation in every brain to begin with. So this movement to push everything into that label becomes kind of pointless if normal doesn't exist in any kind of objective sense, that there's always going to be variation. We can say from a social justice perspective that there is, a center, and there are margins, and in the center are the people who are neurotypical, as much as we can even apply that label. People just who don't have for me, I use the label as not people who are not autistic or ADHD. Yes, there can be a label because that's the difference. But saying that, somebody is neurodivergent is implying that they're diverging from a norm when we don't really have a fixed idea of what that norm is. And so I understand that people do, again, want to recategorize and relabel other diagnoses. But for my purposes, for my discussions and my definitions and how I work in exploring autism and ADHD, to me, it's not helpful to lump everybody in. And for example, when I write books about it, I had somebody once say, are you going to discuss all the other forms of neurodivergence? And I'm like, well, no, because they're vastly different. They would require their own books. And besides the point that I don't kind of categorize those things as neurodivergence, personally speaking, it would require its own exploration, and there's very little similarity between, let's say, bipolar and ADHD. And I would never presume to act like they are two and the same, just because people popularly in popular culture have decided, it seems sometimes arbitrarily, to put them in the same category. Now, I respect people's decisions to do that, and I understand their reasoning as to why they do that, and we can agree to disagree on how we choose to use the label, but there is no consensus, least of all in the scientific community, that they fall under this arbitrary label of neurodivergence. So when people argue and fight tooth and nail and oppose me when I kind of gently push back and hey, there's no consensus, I understand the desire to fight and advocate for what they believe in and what they feel is important, but I think we also have to respect that not everybody agrees and there's no consensus on this. And we can peaceably go our separate ways and disagree on the topic, but here are some of the reasons that I've outlined. And I think it's worth considering those rather than shutting down and just going, well, I believe this label should be applied to this, this, and this. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Where do you sit in terms of using the neurodivergence label? Does it bother you if it's only specific diagnoses, or do you feel like it should be more inclusive? What are your thoughts about some of the challenges that come up with using this label that I've discussed? I would love to hear your thoughts.